1 in 5 Americans think violence could be necessary to reach their political objectives in 2024. That's according to a new NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll. That may only be a little more than 20% of Americans, but it's still an alarming number. However, research varies on this topic, with other polls showing lower numbers. Here's what some of you across the country had to say about political violence and the way this country has become so divided.
It's a disaster and a nightmare. There's too much acrimony and the sides are too polarized.
It's sad. It's ugly. It's scary.
I am concerned about violence following the election.
We see already the violence that had happened in the past, so I could definitely see it happening again with this election.
I think January 6th was a shock for all of us, and we shouldn't be shocked anymore.
I think it could be worse than that, something broader than January 6th. It could be around the country even.
I pray for our country. I pray for unity. I don't know if it's possible. I have faith and hope, but man, it's dwindling, but I still believe in this country.
Joining us now is Princeton University Political Scientist, Dr. Lauren Wright. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. You know, the fact that more than 20% of Americans believe violence may be the answer when it comes to the upcoming elections is quite alarming, but does that surprise you?
It does. The best possible research I know about this comes from my colleague at Dartmouth, Sean Westwood, who leads the Polarization Research Lab. And what they find is that these surveys showing vast support for partisan violence are actually really severely overstated. And part of that just comes from replicating the surveys. They asked over 100,000 people what they thought about this. And once you ask the question a different way and exclude people who speed through the survey, it's actually much closer to 4%, even 3% among Democrats and Republicans. So I don't see that kind of disheartening evidence in the data myself.
Right. And in this survey of those polled, and there were, 28% said they believed violence was the answer. 28% were Republican, only 12% were Democratic, and 18% were independent. So from what I'm gathering, those numbers don't really seem consistent with what you've heard.
They don't. And I actually don't think there's big partisan differences in this one way or the other. I'll go back to the overall picture in a second, but the same research I just mentioned asks about specific acts, like, for instance, the most extreme one, partisan motivated murder. Do you support that? And it actually finds about 2% of Democrats say yes and 1% of Republicans say yes. So there's certain areas where Democrats seem to have more propensity for this than Republicans and vice versa. But again, we're really splitting hairs here. It's a fringe, a very small sliver of the American population. Most people don't support this in any way, shape, or form, and that, I think, should be encouraging to people.
The January 6th attack shocked the nation, but as a political scientist, Did you see that coming when you look back at politics in this country and the way they've unfolded in recent years?
I don't think anyone who's being really honest completely saw it coming. I mean, It was an event that we haven't seen in over 100 years in our country, anything like it in our history, really. And, I think that Trump's ability to motivate his supporters to commit violence, in some cases, to be very disruptive at the least, and to do real damage at the most, and put people's lives at risk, I think is very, very concerning. And, some of my colleagues who study media and politics might have said, if you looked at the online chatter activity, if you looked at how angry people are at each other and Trump's ability to rile those people up, you wouldn't have been surprised. But I am still surprised because I study political communication. I teach a graduate class on that. And, Julia, a lot of people in this country don't even vote. And so expecting that they'll somehow take up arms against their neighbors on a large scale, especially now after January 6th, I don't think we'll see anything close again. And yes, I was very surprised when it happened and very, very upset.
Yeah, it was certainly a very upsetting, remarkable event. And during that day, we saw lawmakers and public officials' safety threatened, including, every member of Congress that was there, Vice President Mike Pence, then Vice President. But before that, we saw Congressman Steve Scalise and Senator Rand Paul. They were victims of political violence. How concerned are you for the safety of lawmakers going forward?
Well, I do think at any time in American history, lawmakers have received attention, an outsized amount. But now I do think they're targeted and publicized in a way they haven't been just because of the media environment. And so we're seeing more security precautions, which are absolutely appropriate. And I think if there's any silver lining to January 6th, it's that, again, Capitol Police, different intelligence organizations, different government offices are ready that this is at least somewhat of a possibility, and they've now put more resources and attention behind this. So I think it's appropriate.
We know that former President Trump was, his name, he was very much connected and, some would say played a central role in January
Absolutely.
6th. I know there's back and forth on that. But I mean, look, we're seeing him run for president again. And at the same time, he's facing these 4 criminal trials. He's on trial in New York as we speak. Are you concerned about the potential for political violence surrounding his criminal trials?
I think that's really good context, and you stated it so clearly and so fairly and responsibly, Julia. On the one hand, I think that Trump is inextricable from January 6th in many ways. But on the other hand, a lot of people aren't paying attention to Trump, his trials, and any sort of potential for violence, any sort of, disturbing activity that could come from it. And so let me say that a little bit more in a more digestible way. Most Americans, when they wake up and they think about the election, if they even do at this point, they think of day-to-day concerns. They think of prices, they think of wages, they think of how am I going to pay for my kids' health care and all these bills that I face every day. And Trump, his trials and the potential upset that might come of it actually is really low on their list of priorities. And so while we should recognize the potential for these things to go awry, and anytime there's a protest, they can, I also think it's incumbent on both parties and all analysts to look at this through a realistic lens and to think about how most Americans aren't paying that much attention.
Yeah, and polling would certainly back that up, that, the economy is once again their top concerns when it comes to voters. But, another top story this week are the college protests that we've seen on the campuses of Columbia, Yale, and NYU, and more campuses. More than 100 pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested across those campuses, including at, those schools I just mentioned. The protests shuttered campuses. Columbia canceled in-person classes, and the gates to Harvard Yard were closed to the public. How do you see the Israeli Gaza War impacting political violence, not just on these campuses, but really across the country?
Well, I think it's twofold. One, when most people look at these protests, they see absolute chaos, and they know most of these kids aren't Trump voters, and many are not Republicans. And that's just a fact that this is fringe, but nonetheless activity from left-leaning groups and left-leaning students, progressive students. And so I think really hurts Democrats in a year that they have a lot of advantages heading into the election, including issues like abortion and just non-chaos of a potential Donald Trump run or White House occupancy. And, we have the same concerns at Princeton. One of my former students, Abigail Anthony, who now works at the National Review, just broke the story this morning that Princeton's pro-Palestine students are considering a similar encampment. We've been assured that they are not allowed to do this and that it's very disruptive. So frankly, it's much closer to home for me, and I'm waiting to see what will happen.
Yeah, I think it's going to be close to home for a lot of people on or connected to college campuses. I want to go to a recent poll from the Associated Press and the NORC Center for Public Affairs Research that found that the majority of Americans still share the same core values. 9 out of 10 U.S. adults said they feel the right to vote, the right to equal protection under the law, and the right to privacy are extremely or very important. Lauren, how is it possible for a nation to share these core values but at the same time remain so deeply divided?
I think a lot of it is how the news is framed. And I'm so glad you ended up on this optimistic note, because it's true. Americans do share a lot of values, and we see that across a range of policies too. You know, when we ask people, do you want better healthcare? Do you want teachers to get paid more? Do you want to secure Social Security for the future? Do you support Medicare expansion? Most Americans say yes. It's just on the details. How do we pay for this? Who should pay for this? Where you see opinions start to split up. And so, yes, Americans still share core values. Most Americans are moderate, even though they lean one way or the other. You know, they tend to identify more with patriotic values than they do with criticism of the country. And so, yes, on these big things, Americans are in step, and it's important to remember.
And that same poll also found that 84% of Americans say they feel the same way about freedom of religion. Yet at the same time, like I said, we continue to see so much hate in this country. I mean, can you speak to that on the religious note?
Sure. And it really relates to a question you asked earlier about the potential for political violence. You know, most support for partisan political violence actually doesn't come from older people. It comes from highly educated younger people. And it's from this same group, I think, of younger voters who are encamping on college campuses, who are leading pro-Palestine protests. And there is a lack of tolerance there for pro-Israel students. That's just been quite blatant, and it's very disappointing. But I do think it's among highly educated young elites, and it doesn't describe different sectors of the voting population.
You know, just to wrap here, Lauren, we're in the middle of a really tumultuous election cycle with two very polarizing candidates. Is there any hope in sight for unity?
I think so. You know, we only have two choices in this country. We have RFK Jr., of course, too, this year. But we have a, simple majority, single ballot system. And we're probably never going to elect a third party candidate. So a lot of the strife we see is not that people absolutely love Joe Biden and absolutely love Donald Trump. A lot of voters are just looking and they're choosing what they see as the lesser of two evils. And so that really underlines this theme of more unity than division. But when you have to make a choice, people do pick their sides and fight very hard.
That's a really good optimistic note to end on, and some very important context.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I really appreciate it. Dr. Lauren Wright, thank you so much.
Thanks, Julia.